The classes are like a lot of work.
So sometimes, there's one summer where like I got like really tan, but then it's like
All right, a couple of announcements.
Just don't combine it.
Okay, so the review session is going to be at 9 a.m. on May 1st, right? So a week from today, it was mentioned that the review session is going to be on Wednesday, but it's going to be in lane 124. So I have lane 124 for that. So it'll last about an hour, very similar to what we've been doing on the review sessions for the first two midterms. The Values in Capitalism, which is an arm of American Enterprise Institute or subsidiary or whatever, you might want to look up this on their website. It's called Values in Capitalism, and it's called the Young Scholars Program. And what this is it's a $5,000 award that you do a year's worth of research. And you do the paper, and at the end of the year, you present it to a panel of experts in Washington, D.C., so they pay for your way out there, and et cetera. But they give 6 of these awards out. So I think June 20th is the deadline for this. June 30th. So June 30th, by June 30th, you submit a proposal. So anyway, you should look this up on the website, but you submit a proposal. If you get it, then you get $5,000, and you have a faculty sponsor. I sponsored Eric LaRose 2 years ago, and he ended up getting it. So he got $5,000 and was able to use his research for some graduate study. Anyway, if you're interested at all, take a look. And as I said, we've had Hillsdale College, the first time that we even heard about it was 2 years ago. So we didn't get anybody last year, but got somebody 2 years ago. So if you're interested, take a look. $5,000 is usually pretty good money. All right. Fan pick of the week is the High Keynes. Has anybody heard of them? Actually, a couple people in 10 o'clock heard of them. They are a Celtic music band. If you don't like Celtic music, you're probably not going to like them because they're really Celtic music. Anyway, I think it's worth, if you get on YouTube and look, they have a song called Girl from Galway. That's a good song. So anyway, give you if you haven't listened to much Celtic music, it give you an introduction to that. And if you like Celtic music, they're really good. If you listen to Celtic music and you really don't like it, then you're not going to like it. All right. Also, you might notice this. The shirt is from the 1990 Liat Cross Country Championships, and you might see who won that year and who was in last place that year. So, yeah, that was a good year for our cross country team. All right, so last time we were gave you the definitions that we're going to be using, and we talked about gross domestic product. We said it was the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a given year, not counting intermediate goods. We don't want to count the oil when it's also refined into gasoline. So we don't just want to count what the final goods and services were. And we talked about consumer price index as being a mechanism to try to deal with what's happening to prices. If we're going to measure the value of things, the value of all final goods and services, then it's going to be price times quantity. And if quantity stayed the same but prices doubled, it would look like we have double GDP, gross domestic product. And if we're trying to measure what actually got produced, that's going to be a problem. So how do you deal with price changes? Now we noted that there's all sorts of different ways to do that. There's the implicit price deflator, there's the producer price index, but the one when you hear on the news it says prices went up by 2% or whatever, they're usually talking about the consumer price index. And so we defined what the consumer price index was. We noted it was the market basket of all the consumers you bought, and you compare it in the year that you're talking about to the base year, and you decide how much it went up in cost. If it doubled, then the index would go to 200 from 100. And so that sort of gives you a measure about what's happening in prices. We noted that there's a lot of problems in calculating either of these things. The gross domestic product we'll talk about in a moment, but you'll see it's down to 3 decimal places. Well, the idea that somehow this thing's accurate to 3 decimal places is sort of nuts. But anyway, but you could tell that a country that had a $20 trillion GDP and one that had a $5 trillion GDP, that they were in fact substantially different. But to tell that we had 20.125 versus 20.376, that's probably not something you can actually do. The same thing we said, how do you deal with the consumer price index? How do you deal with things like you aren't buying the same market basket of goods? We said the base year is 1982 to 84. Well, you guys aren't buying the same market basket of goods today, so how do you deal with that? And even if you were, how do you deal with quality differences? How do you deal with the fact that the phone that you buy today is different than the phone that you would have bought in 1984? In fact, I have in the office, if you come in there, I have an old black rotary dial telephone. And, you made sparks when, that's how it worked when you were calling somebody, right? You didn't really want to call people that had a lot of zeros in their number because they'd crank all the way around and let it come back, right? You want to just call people that had 337, not 7, 332 or something like that, right? So, very substantial difference in phones. How do you account for that? And of course, the Bureau of Economic Analysis hires all sorts of economists, from BA economists to PhD economists, to try to deal with how you calculate GDP. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics hires all sorts of economists to deal with both the empirical efforts and with the theory of how you deal with these things. But for our purposes, we want to just say, okay, we have a mechanism where we're trying to measure what happens to price changes. We have a mechanism where we're trying to calculate how much stuff got produced. So now we're going to deal with Keynesian economics, John Maynard Keynes. We noted that when we were looking at the rise of government from 1913 on, why did the federal government get so large compared to what it was before, both in the United States but other parts of the world? In the West, this is how the West grew rich, but we noted that one of the things that changed people's attitudes about the growth of government were World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And in 1936, right, John Maynard Keynes writes the general theory, and what he's arguing is that the market economies could get stuck at a point where you have large amounts of unemployment. He's writing in 1936, the Great Depression starts in 1928, and he's going, look, it's 8 years later, we still have high unemployment. This is not what the classical economists told you. We should have seen wages fall until the excess supply of labor is eliminated. That didn't happen, so something else must be at work. And so his idea was that wages were sticky downwards. And he said, okay, here's how we got to deal with this. We have to deal with the economy as a whole. We have to look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We had been looking at the first part of the semester, the same thing that the class economists are looking at individual markets. The market for chalk, the market for peanuts, the market for shoes, etc. Right? We looked at demand and supply curves for each of those things. So then Keynes comes along and says, no, here's what we need to do. We need to look at the economy as a whole. Because what we really want to do is say, why is it that we got all this unemployment for long periods of time? And the reason is because the demand for all goods and services is equal to the supply of all goods and services, but it's not at the point where we've got full employment. That is, we're at a position where lots of people are unemployed, but the economy's in equilibrium. It's not moving from there. So if you were to, and so, what is this about? This is about the macroeconomy. And that's where you get macroeconomics. By the way, Professor Clark is offering Principles of Macroeconomics, Econ 203, first semester, the summer session. So if you're interested in doing that, it doesn't require Econ 202. It doesn't require Principles of Micro. So anyway, if you're looking for a summer school class, then it would deal with what we're going to be talking about the last couple lectures. So, but anyway, it's called macroeconomics, right? It's macroeconomics. Didn't exist 1930s, right? No one ever heard of macroeconomics. Why is it called macro? Because it deals with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We're going to look at the economy as a whole. So, if we were to draw a picture of this, and again, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be consolidating all of Econ 203 down into 3.5 lectures, okay? So we're going to give you the big picture, right? There's a lot of detail that we're just going to gloss over. But here's the big picture. The big picture is if we could think of a way of putting quantity here, and this is quantity of all goods and services. And I'll just drop services. When I say goods, I mean goods and services. So we're going to put the quantity of all goods and services there, and we're going to put some measure of price up here. And this is going to be think of some sort of price index up there where we're trying to measure the price of all goods and services. So that's the key to this Keynesian macroeconomics, is that we're going to be looking at as if we could combine all the goods and look at the price of all the goods and try to make those things come into equilibrium at full employment. So if you took this general idea, we'd have an aggregate demand curve that looks like that. All right, it's downward sloping. And again, if you take principles of micro and intermediate micro, there's also explanation in the theory about why that thing ought to be downward sloping, but generally that looks like a regular demand curve, right? So higher prices, aggregate demand is lower. Lower prices, aggregate demand is higher. Now, on the supply side, we would have the same thing that we did before, in that this would be aggregate supply. Now, what happens is aggregate supply becomes vertical at full employment. So the idea is that as prices are going up, we're going to produce more stuff, right? At some point, you can't produce more stuff, right? Prices can keep going up, but if we're at full employment, you can't make more. I can't make more Doritos or tacos or anything else. If everybody's fully employed, if all the factories are in full use, they're all operating at capacity, then I can't get more Q, because right Q is the real amount of stuff that got produced. So if you were to draw the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, they look like this. So the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical, and we'll call this full employment. That's whatever that quantity is, that's where we're going to be at full employment. Now, here's Keynes' story. Keynes' story draws that picture. Rod Stewart, tells a story, right? So what is this picture telling a story about? He says that, okay, here's what's going to happen is the economy is going to come to equilibrium there, right? This is equilibrium. And the problem is aggregate demand and aggregate supply are in equilibrium, but it's not where there's full employment, right? So we're goofed. And that's why this is now 1936, and we're sitting around, and it's been, the economy's in equilibrium, looks like it's been going on, but lots of people are unemployed. So how do we deal with that? Well, if you're just look at that picture, and I said, okay, how can I make it, using that picture, how can I make it so aggregate demand equals aggregate supply? What would you do?
Shift aggregate supply.
Yeah, it ain't rocket surgery, like I said, right? You're going to shift the aggregate demand curve, okay? If I shift the aggregate demand curve, then I'm good, right? If I can shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, I can get the equilibrium where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply at full employment, and we're good to go, okay? Notice also that price is going to be going up. Okay, and we'll talk more about that on Friday. But if you were to look at this, you go, okay, I got to shift that aggregate demand curve if I'm going to get out of this Great Depression. So now the question is, how do I do that? In order to do that, I got to know what are the components of aggregate demand, right? So we look at what are the components of aggregate demand. The first one is consumption, right? So again, we're always talking about final goods and services. So what is this? This is whatever consumers buy, right? If you get your teeth cleaned at the dentist's office, then that's going to be consumption. If you were to, go to Saucy Dogs and, buy a barbecue sandwich, that's going to be consumption. If you were to put gasoline in your car, that's consumption. If you were to hire Steve Beer to do your taxes, that's consumption. Okay? So consumption are all goods that are final goods that consumers buy. Second is investment. An investment is new capital goods. And what are new capital goods? Capital goods are goods, and we talked about this a little bit before, goods used to produce other goods. So if you were to look at investment, if you were to buy a robot, and you're a Burger King and you buy a robot. Walmart is buying robots in order to clean stuff up if there's a spill or something like that. They're buying robots to do that kind of stuff. So that is new investment, and that's new capital, so that's investment. This piece of chalk is investment. If we bought this piece of chalk, it is investment. Why? Because it's used to produce educational services. That clock is education. That computer over there, the blackboard and erasers. Those are the chairs you're sitting in. Those are all investment goods. If you bought them new this year, right? They're all capital goods. And so who buys this stuff, right? Producers, right? Producers buy this stuff. Now notice that whether a good is an investment good or a capital good depends on its use. That is, if you buy a car, that's a consumption good. If you're an Uber driver and you buy a car, that's an investment good, right? Because the reason you've got the car is to drive around. I actually rode in an Uber. I'm not a big fan of technological progress, but when we were visiting my son out in New York, he got an Uber for us to go to the airport, so I didn't actually have to. I do have it on my phone, I just never used it. So I didn't have to do it. He somehow did it, and then the Uber comes and you just get in it and it goes. But anyway, the Uber driver, when he bought that car, that was not a consumption good, right? That was an investment good. The third kind of good it's government spending, right? Only this is government spending on final goods. Right, government spending on final goods. And I don't want to count government spending that is a transfer. That is, Social Security would not be counted in government spending, because if I count it as government spending, I'd also count it as consumption when Granny got her Social Security tax and went out and bought consumption goods with it. It would be counted twice. So just like you don't count intermediate goods, you're not going to count transfers that the federal government does. So it's government spending on final goods and services, and this is all levels, right? State, local, state, local, and federal. So, for example, if the government buys a battleship, okay, that would show up as government spending. If the Hillsdale Community School District hires a teacher, that's government spending, right? Because it's producing educational services. If the federal government were to, when it's fixing I don't know if you watch, but rip-on streets being fixed, okay? So that would be government investment, right? Because that'd be capital. If you can think of the road as being used to produce transportation services, that would be government consumption, or excuse me, government final good, because it's government investment. So anytime the government spends, that's going to add to aggregate demand if it's spending on a good or a service or a investment, builds a bridge or anything like that, okay? And the last part is exports minus imports. So if we were Ford Motor Company and somebody in Germany bought a car that Ford Motor Company made, okay, that would be an export. What's the value of the car? Whatever they paid for it, and where did it get produced? It got produced here. So we would count the exports as part of aggregate demand. If you bought a BMW, right, that didn't get produced here. So your spending on that BMW is going to be subtracted off. So exports increase GDP and imports reduce gross domestic product. Now, again, there's all sorts of problems thinking about this. One of this friend of mine that I went to graduate school at Berkeley together. His name's Hal Varian. Anyway, Hal has this theory that we discussed a little bit, that what you really ought to be doing is looking at the value added of the import. That is, if what you do is you spend $400 on developing the software and everything else for the iPhone, and then you then assemble the thing in China, and it comes in as a $500 iPhone, then China only added $100 of value. And so what you really ought to be doing instead of, but the way this is going to be calculated is going to count it at an import of $500. But his argument is that you should only be looking at the value added of such things. But again, that's just another aside on how you actually would do this. But nonetheless, it's not the way we do it. Notice also that if you were to import, if you were conies and swirls down here, and you make a banana split, okay? If that banana came in from Brazil, okay, that import is being used to produce stuff. And it turns out that more than half of our imports are either machinery, actually investment goods, or materials that are used to produce manufacturing in the United States. More than half of our inputs are not things that you guys are consuming. It's stuff that ends up in the production process. Nonetheless, we're not going to pay a whole lot of attention to this piece because this piece is relatively small to the rest. So, if you go to table 1.1.5, Gross domestic product, and if you get on the Bureau of Economic, we noted that the Bureau of Economic Analysis is the ones that calculate what GDP is. Then you can find what these numbers are. I'm going to put them up here in a second, but it's worthwhile for you to go out and to get on the BEA website and try to operate the thing. You could start out by just Googling table 1.1.5 bea.gov and you'll get the table. But it's useful for you to go out there and try to figure out how to manipulate that website. And you guys are probably savvy enough to know how to do that. Right? This is 2019. I'm sure you know how to get on somebody's website and figure out how the darn thing works. Right? It always bugged me that they put these little 3 things here. Like, you're supposed to know what the hell that is, right? All of a sudden, it just happened one day, right? Of course, when I was in your seat, they didn't have the internet or anything like the internet. But anyway, I'm supposed to somehow know. Oh yeah, that's where you're supposed to find the thing, right? You didn't click on the 3 things? Oh, that's why you couldn't find it. But anyway, you guys know how to do that. So get on the BEA website, look at and find table 1.1.5, just although I'm going to give you the numbers, but just to tell you, just so you know how to gather data. There's all sorts of data on that BEA website. All right, so just to give you an idea, okay, the GDP is on an annual basis, right? It is the value of all the value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a given year. When you get on the BE website, it's done quarterly. But it's not how much got produced in that quarter. It's if that much got produced in that quarter, that's how much would be produced in the year. It's an annualized basis. So if you look at the latest number is in the 4th quarter of 2018. So if you do 20184, actually the 1st quarter is about to come out. But anyway, if we look at GDP as a whole, it's 20.865. GDP is $20.865 trillion. Right? So about $21 trillion, probably 1st quarter of this year is probably coming out at 21 trillion. Okay, so just ballpark, $21 trillion. If we look at what the components of that are, consumption is 14.188 trillion. So as you can see, consumption is a big chunk of GDP. So sometimes you'll see stuff that will say, well, we're in a recession. We really need to increase consumption demand because it's a big part of GDP, which it is. Investment demand is, it's called gross private domestic investment. It's 3.766 trillion. Government spending, again, on all final goods and services, state, local, federal, government spending is almost always about what investment spending is. Investment tends to be more volatile than government spending, but they're generally in the ballpark. Investment spending, it's called gross private domestic investment is 3.76, what did I just do? Wrong. Oh no, that's right, what did I just say? Okay, government spending. It's called government consumption expenditures and gross investment is 3.569 trillion. So, when you look at these numbers, if you look at it over time, these things are not going to be too far off. Consumption is usually going to be 70% of GDP, and then these things are going to make up basically the other 29%, because exports minus imports is a small number. It is, in the 4th quarter, it was minus 658.9 billion. Okay? So, exports minus imports is less than $1 trillion, and GDP is about 21 trillion, which means we're not going to spend much time on it. Professor Butters has classes in I think in international trade, international money and banking, things like that. So if you're interested in that, you know, you can spend some time with Professor Butters' classes. But because it's a small number and we don't have time to talk about a whole lot of stuff in macro, we're just going to not deal much with it. Just in terms of the numbers, exports are about 2.5 trillion, and imports were about 3.2 trillion. So imports are in the range of government spending and investment. Exports are a little bit less than that. Imports are about in that range. So independently, they're moderately large. But our concern is from the Keynesian model. Our concern is we're not going to worry about trying to change exports and imports because the difference between the two is small relative to overall GDP. So now the question becomes, okay, how do I change? Well, again, when you look at this number, it's that 21 trillion for the fourth quarter. That's not how much got produced just in the fourth quarter. That's on an annualized basis. So if you look at the first quarter was 20 trillion, the second quarter was 20.4 trillion, third 20.7 trillion, fourth 20.9 trillion. Okay, so it wasn't like 80 trillion got produced. That's how much was produced in that quarter if it were on an annualized basis. It turns out that what happens is the BEA revises that number as well. So if you were to look at this table 1.1.5 and you were to look at, for example, the third quarter of 2016, that number is probably going to look different if you had looked it up on, let's say, May of 2017, because they revise it. It turns out that right now, in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a problem somehow in the Federal Reserve the BEA getting the first quarter right. They are systematically underestimating what the first quarter GDP number is. And so if you're, if you're a hedge fund manager or something and you're trying to figure out what's happening in the economy, they're starting to say, okay, well, whatever that BEA number is probably a little bit low. It's probably, and so the BEA is trying to deal with that. They've got, again, they hire economists to go out there and try and figure out why it is that this systematically underestimating first quarter. And again, that's moderately recent that's happened. All right. So now the question becomes, okay, how do I move these things around, right? How do I increase aggregate demand? Well, if we start out with consumption, okay, we got to think about what does it depend on? And we already did this, right? In the first part of the semester, we said your demand for hats depends on what? On the price of substitutes, the price of complements, taste, and your income. Well, if we're talking about consumption of goods as a whole, it doesn't make sense to talk about substitutes and complements because we're talking about all one big chunk of goods. The government could come in and try to convince you all to buy stuff, right? I could come in and say, let's make America great again. We're in a recession. The way to do that is go out and just buy your wife, something at K Jewelers. Okay? Could be effective, probably not. So what we focus on then is what? Is the income. And how does that work? That is what's your disposable income. And disposable income is your income minus taxes. I don't know if you just saw the news, but this 24-year-old just won the lottery and won $780 million, okay? And so they have him posing by the sign that, this check of $784 million, okay? He quit his job, by the way. But take home less than 400 million, right? After taxes, he's only got less than 400 million to spend. Now, he can probably figure out a way to do that. But nonetheless, 300 and something million dollars, almost 400 million dollars went off to the government. So if I wanted to increase your consumption demand, what do I got to do? I'm going to reduce taxes. If I reduce taxes, then I can increase your disposable income. When I increase your disposable income, consumption demand goes up. Now, by now, you know that I will ask you to give me the logic of these things, right? To give me the sequence. This causes this, causes this, causes this, right? Because that's how you can discover unintended consequences of things, okay? So, how does that, if I, you'll see when I give you the take-home essay, I'm going to ask you about this, and you're going to say, if I were to reduce taxes, here's the linkage, right? Taxes go down, disposable income goes up, and consumption demand goes up. And then what happens? Aggregate demand goes up, right? That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right. So that's the linkage here. What could be a problem? A problem could be, what happens if this happens, but this doesn't happen, right? What if you save? Right? That's what Keynes called the paradoxic thrift. That is, if I cut your taxes and increase your income, and you guys save it, we're goofed, right? What if I went out there and I was Barack Obama, I'm in the recession, and I cut income taxes, and you guys all turn around and you save it. Then what happened was I cut taxes, disposable income went up, consumption demand did not change. So the aggregate demand curve is not going to move, and so I'm going to be goofed. So what I want to do is I would like to reduce taxes for people who will consume more. Right? For those who consume more out of the next dollar. If you were to, when you take Econ 203, what's the terminology for this thing is going to be what we've already talked about, margin utility, right? Marginal benefit, marginal cost. That's going to be the marginal propensity to consume. That's what you're going to see when you take Econ 203. So to talk about the marginal propensity to consume. Right? So you want to give the money, you want to reduce the taxes of those people who have a higher marginal propensity to consume. So for example, I give Bill Gates a tax cut of $300. He's likely that he's just going to save it, right? He's probably not going to go out and take his friends out to dinner because he got $300 tax reduction, okay? But if you are low income and you got $300, then you might drive more, use more gasoline. You might, buy some more clothes that you wouldn't have bought. You might go out to dinner when you wouldn't otherwise have done it. So all those things are consumption goods, and so what I want to do is I want to direct my tax cut to people who are going to consume. Notice this is very different than when we were talking about the role of profit, where we were saying that what are we trying to do? We're trying to get you to innovate, right? Why would we cut your taxes? We would cut your taxes so that you would take on the risk of innovating. Or we would cut your taxes so that you would go out and work more, right? That's not the story. The story doesn't have anything to do with, we'll talk more about this on Friday, but it doesn't have anything to do with supply side economics. It's all about demand. It's all about, I'm not cutting your taxes so that you'll go out and work more hours, and I'm not going to cut your taxes so you'll go out and invent you know, the 6G network or something. I don't even know. Is that possible? Who knows? I'm rationally ignorant about 3, 4, 5, 6Gs. I don't even know if you can make a 6G. But anyway, so that's not the purpose, right? The purpose is to get you to buy more. So, if I were Barack Obama, right? And I come in and it's 2009, I get elected in 2008, we've got the Great Recession going on, and I'm doing Keynes in economics, I'm going to reduce taxes, but what did Barack Obama do? Obama cut the Social Security tax, didn't cut the income tax. And why is that? Because that's going to be more focused on low income. With the idea that low-income people have a higher marginal propensity to consume. They're likely to spend more out of it. So, half of American households don't pay any income tax, right? Because the standard deduction is sufficiently high that half the households aren't going to pay any income tax at all. So, if I cut the income tax, that's not going to add the consumption demand of people who aren't going to get an increase in disposable income. Even if they did, I want them to spend more, and low-income people spend more out of the next dollar, so could I focus that income tax just on the low-income people? How does Social Security tax work? As soon as you make $600, you're paying Social Security taxes, right? Anytime you earn over $600, your employer is going to withhold your Social Security taxes. Or if you're independent contractor, you mow people's lawns, you're supposed to file self-employed person tax. On April 15th, you were supposed to file your self-employed person tax, which you probably didn't, but you were supposed to if you had more than $600 in income that wasn't withdrawn. So, if I cut the Social Security tax, and also the Social Security tax stops after you reach a certain threshold, it's about $107,000. Once you have over $100,000 and something in earnings, you don't pay any Social Security taxes. So if I wanted to focus the tax cut on people who are going to spend more, I would cut the Social Security tax, which is exactly what Obama did. Okay? So let's look at government spending. Notice again, government spending was on basically what? Final goods, right? He said goods that either are consumption goods or goods that are used to produce other goods. So if we had an increase in spending on teacher salaries, then that would add to government spending. Notice that's exactly what the Obama administration did, right? They had what was called a stimulus package. So government increased spending by $1 trillion on what? On shovel-ready projects. That is, if you had something, it didn't matter what it did, right? As long as it was shovel-ready, as long as you could spend it right now. It also spent lots of money, gave money to states to funnel down to the local school districts to hire teachers and increase teacher salaries, right? Why doing that? Because you're going to spend more on educational services, and so that will add to, that's government spending on final goods and services. Boom. That's exactly what the Obama administration did. Clearly, the reaction of the Obama administration to the Great Recession would fit the Keynesian model to a K. Okay? But notice also that one of the things that the Obama administration did was to have the Federal Reserve lower interest rates. And what we're going to talk about on Friday is when you lower interest rates, investment demand goes up under the Keynesian model. So all the things that Barack Obama did were consistent with him being a Keynesian. Now, why are, if you look at Hayek was a colleague of John Maynard Keynes at the London School of Economics at the time that Keynes was writing the general theory. Hayek, if you read Hayek, what does he say? He says, this makes no sense at all. This whole system doesn't make sense. How in the world can you possibly aggregate all sorts of different goods and services, and how do I know that the value of this machine, I could have two identical machines, one would be operating very efficiently, the other person doesn't know how to drive the darn thing, and so that same machine would have different values, and that we're combining them all, and this whole thing makes no sense at all. So why would you learn about Keynesian economics if you were a follower of, and Mises is even worse. Mises just didn't like Keynes. It's like, well, Mises' stuff is pretty nasty when he's talking about Keynes. But anyway, why would you follow what Mises and, if you follow what Mises and Keynes were doing, what's called the Austrian business cycle theory, if you were doing that, why in the world would you learn about Keynesian economics? And the answer is because lots of people will be doing Keynesian economics. Okay? If you are a advisor, if you're Paul Krugman and you're advising Barack Obama and you believe in Keynesian economics, you're going to tell him here's what he's going to do. So you can, if you know that Obama got elected president and you knew he was listening to Paul Krugman, you'd be going, oh, I'll bet Social Security tax is going to get cut. I'll bet that we're going to reduce interest rates. I'll bet that we're going to increase government spending on goods and services, and that's exactly what happened. So if you look at the Econ 101 online, Lecture 7 is what we're going to finish this on Friday. Lecture 7 is this. Lecture 8 is also connected with what we're going to do, because in order to talk about investment demand, we're going to notice that it depends on the interest rate. But how does the government affect the interest rate? Well, it does it through affecting the money supply. So we're going to have to learn about money in order to talk about how we get to the government affecting interest rates through the Federal Reserve. So look at look at the lectures 7 and 8 on the online course, particularly when you go to answer the take-home essay, which I'm going to give you on Monday. You'll get the take-home essay. I'll post it on the Wolfram folder and box. So I'll post that, and again, it's going to be take-home. It's just going to be a straight essay question. It's not research or anything else. So look at lectures 7 and 8 on the online course, certainly by the time you get to Monday.